Would you risk everything to help a stranger, knowing it might cost you the last thing you have left? The rain came down like punishment, relentless, drowning the Pine Creek Logistics Depot in silver and mud. Beneath the harsh floodlights, a crowd gathered, not out of solidarity, but to witness a reckoning. Jake Carter, hands trembling, uniform soaked and smeared with oil, stood exposed in the storm. Before him, Rick Jordan, the kind of boss who measured loyalty by obedience, not sacrifice, tore the security badge from Jake's chest. No explanation, no mercy. Jake's teenage son, Mason, clutched his battered backpack, watching the only man he'd ever called a hero get dismantled in public. In Mason's eyes, confusion and fear flickered, but no one else seemed to care. His father had broken the rules by helping a ragged veteran on a night when no one else would. Not a single co-worker stepped forward. Most found their boots and the rain far more interesting. Only one figure lingered on the edge of the crowd, an older man, limping, silent, his gaze sharp and steady. He saw the humiliation. He recognized the price. So I ask you again, would you do it? Would you give up your place, your pride, for a stranger's desperate plea? This really happened. Comment where you're watching from. And if you believe real courage still matters, hit subscribe and stay with us. Because sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones no one else dares to make. Dovetail barely appeared on the map, a nowhere place where the nights were long and the jobs were short. Jake Carter's world shrank to a rented room and the quiet rise and fall of Mason's breath at dawn. Some mornings, Jake lingered in the doorway, watching his son sleep, heart heavy with the knowledge that one mistake could cost everything. He'd survived war, but the fight for Mason's next heartbeat felt harder. Meanwhile, in the soft blue dark, Mason tiptoed toward the door, shoes in hand, careful not to wake his father. His chest thumped with fear, not of getting caught, but of failing to make a difference. As the door closed behind him, he whispered, "Hang in there, Dad. I'm trying too." Jake's world had narrowed to 2 rooms above a closed bakery, a battered Ford parked on the street, and the single heartbeat that mattered most. Mason. 13 years old, but already carrying burdens too heavy for his small frame. Mason had inherited his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn streak, since his wife had died 3 years ago. Cancer, swift and merciless. Jake had poured every ounce of energy into protecting his son from a world that seemed determined to break the gentle. But fate is never simple. Mason was born with a rare heart defect, a condition that made every winter cold sharper, every fever more dangerous. The surgery he needed hovered like a storm cloud. Hope and threat rolled into one, just out of reach for a family living on the edge. Jake never complained. He put on his uniform, clocked in at Pine Creek every morning, and did what he was trained to do: fix what was broken, hide what was hurting. But Rick Jordan, the warehouse foreman, never let him forget the difference between soldiering and surviving. Rick had a talent for making even simple orders sound like accusations. "Heroes die broke, Carter. Learn to keep your head down," Rick would sneer, tossing paperwork onto Jake's workbench. The words stung, not because they were true, but because Jake feared, deep down, that they might be. There were days when the shadows beneath his eyes felt like medals of defeat. But Jake's pride wouldn't let him ask for help, not even when bills stacked up or Mason's medication ran low. He carried the weight alone, shoulders bent but unbroken. Late at night, after Mason was asleep, Jake would log into an online forum for veterans, an anonymous place where men and women wrote about battles that never made the news. Sometimes Jake typed out his story. Sometimes he just read. There was comfort in the understanding of strangers. Unbeknownst to Jake, Mason had his own secrets. On the mornings Jake left early for overtime, Mason would sometimes skip first period, slipping out the side door with his backpack zipped shut, heart thumping from more than just exertion. The destination: a cramped tech repair shop 3 blocks from school. Mason had a knack for fixing things: phones, tablets, anything with wires and a circuit board. The owner paid him under the table, no questions asked. Every dollar Mason made went into an old coffee can under his bed, labeled for surgery. He never told his dad. He didn't want to see the guilt in Jake's eyes, didn't want to be another burden. Instead, Mason whispered his own encouragements on cold mornings. "Maybe I can help, even if Dad never asks," he'd mutter, as he slid another crumpled bill into the can. The routine was fragile, but it worked, until the night Jake broke the rules for a stranger. Would you risk everything to help a stranger, knowing it might cost you the last thing you have left? The rain came down like punishment, relentless, drowning the Pine Creek Logistics Depot in silver and mud. Beneath the harsh floodlights, a crowd gathered, not out of solidarity, but to witness a reckoning. Jake Carter, hands trembling, uniform soaked and smeared with oil, stood exposed in the storm. Before him, Rick Jordan, the kind of boss who measured loyalty by obedience, not sacrifice, tore the security badge from Jake's chest. No explanation, no mercy. Jake's teenage son, Mason, clutched his battered backpack, watching the only man he'd ever called a hero get dismantled in public. In Mason's eyes, confusion and fear flickered, but no one else seemed to care. His father had broken the rules by helping a ragged veteran on a night when no one else would. Not a single co-worker stepped forward. Most found their boots and the rain far more interesting. Only one figure lingered on the edge of the crowd. An older man, limping, silent, his gaze sharp and steady. He saw the humiliation. He recognized the price. So I ask you again, would you do it? Would you give up your place, your pride, for a stranger's desperate plea? This really happened. Comment where you're watching from. And if you believe real courage still matters, hit subscribe and stay with us. Because sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones no one else dares to make. Dovetail barely appeared on the map, a nowhere place where the nights were long and the jobs were short. Jake Carter's world shrank to a rented room and the quiet rise and fall of Mason's breath at dawn. Some mornings, Jake lingered in the doorway, watching his son sleep, heart heavy with the knowledge that one mistake could cost everything. He'd survived war, but the fight for Mason's next heartbeat felt harder. Meanwhile, in the soft blue dark, Mason tiptoed toward the door, shoes in hand, careful not to wake his father. His chest thumped with fear, not of getting caught, but of failing to make a difference. As the door closed behind him, he whispered, "Hang in there, Dad. I'm trying too." Jake's world had narrowed to 2 rooms above a closed bakery, a battered Ford parked on the street, and the single heartbeat that mattered most. Mason. 13 years old, but already carrying burdens too heavy for his small frame. Mason had inherited his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn streak. Minutes stretched into an hour. At last, the engine sputtered, roared, and held steady, a fragile heartbeat against the chaos. Tex's hands shook as he offered a limp handshake. "Not many men like you left, Jake. I won't forget this." As the truck disappeared into the night, carrying hope to Maple Hollow. Rick stormed toward them, face flushed with anger. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The look was enough. "You just cost yourself everything, Carter," Rick hissed, voice barely above a growl. "Turn in your badge. You're done." Jake didn't fight. He squeezed Mason's shoulder, forcing a thin smile. "It's all right, son. Sometimes you stand up, even if you're standing alone." Mason swallowed hard, pride and fear tangled in his chest. In that moment, the world felt impossibly heavy. The next morning, Jake's world shrank even further. The rent was overdue. The fridge hummed, nearly empty. A single check sat on the table, severance, cold and unsigned. At the scrapyard on the edge of town, Jake took work hauling rusted parts and broken dreams. The air there was always thick with diesel and regret. The boss barely looked at him, just pointed toward the heap and grunted, "Sort it." Jake's hands moved, but his mind kept drifting. To Tex's gratitude, to Mason's silence, to the quiet shame of being pushed out for doing what felt right. Mason hunched over the flickering laptop in the back of the shop, sweat prickling his skin despite the cold. The folder, Maintenance Logs 2022, was locked behind 3 passwords, each guessed with trembling hands. His eyes darted to the window every few minutes, sure that Rick's shadow might materialize at any second. As files copied onto his USB drive, Mason's breath caught. The whir of the hard drive sounded deafening. In the doorway, a floorboard creaked. He froze, hands clammy. Rick's face appeared, scanning the shop. "You locking up, kid?" Mason forced a weak smile, hiding the drive in his sleeve. "Just about, sir." Only after Rick left did Mason allow himself to shake. He clutched the drive, knowing one mistake could mean more than detention. He felt his heart stutter. Was this why the trucks were always breaking down? Was Rick more than just a bully? When the rain-soaked veteran limped into the Pine Creek lot, something inside Jake refused to look away. He recognized the walk, the 1,000-yard stare, the silent plea for dignity. Jake knew the risk. He needed this job. He needed the paycheck. But somewhere deep inside, honor trumped fear. Because Jake Carter had survived war, loss, and the slow ache of watching his son fight for every breath. He could survive this too, even if it meant starting all over again. The storm that swept through Dovetail that night felt biblical. Wind shrieking through the alleyways, rain hammering the metal rooftops like the ghost of artillery. In the half-lit parking lot of Pine Creek Logistics, Jake Carter could barely see through the sheets of water, but he could hear desperation carried in a broken engine's cough. The headlights flickered and died as the battered rig limped to a stop near the loading bay. Tom Tex Briggs stepped out, the storm plastering his gray hair to his skull, a faded army jacket clinging to his thin shoulders. Tex didn't speak right away. He just glanced at Jake, eyes dark with something Jake recognized too well. That emptiness left behind after you've seen too much. He was a man worn down to the frame, but still trying to move forward. Jake didn't need permission. He gestured for Mason, who was sheltering beneath a sagging awning, to bring his toolkit. Rick Jordan was nowhere in sight, but Jake could feel his disapproval like a presence in the rain. "What's in the back?" Jake asked, his voice low as he knelt by the truck. "Supplies for a clinic out in Maple Hollow. Sick kids. They're waiting for me," Tex answered, shivering. A snapped belt, leaking coolant, a busted fuel line, every problem made worse by the cold and the clock ticking. Jake worked fast, Mason beside him, passing wrenches and learning the delicate ballet of keeping an engine alive with nothing but ingenuity and willpower. At one point, Tex hunched next to Mason and whispered, "Always help the man next to you, kid. Even when it hurts." The lights from the warehouse flickered as Rick finally appeared, his silhouette sharp, voice slicing through the night. "Leave that pile of junk! You got orders, Carter!" Jake looked up, rain streaming down his face, and didn't answer. He just kept working. Mason hesitated, glancing from his father to the foreman. He wanted to ask, "Are we really doing the right thing?" But the words stayed trapped. Nights grew longer. Mason started skipping meals, diving into the world of file directories and encrypted backups. Each discovery made him feel both powerful and terrified. But the more he found, the less he could share. He was scared. What if Jake found out and got hurt all over again? It was Ava Reyes, the quiet mechanic who had always treated Mason with gentle respect, who finally broke the silence. After seeing Mason linger near Pine Creek's gates, she handed him a folded note. "Keep your eyes open. There's more at stake here than your dad's job." Ava's apartment was lit only by a desk lamp, their faces half-shadow. Mason handed over the USB, fingers trembling. Ava reached for it, her hand brushing his. A spark of shared fear. She hesitated, pulling an old notebook from a locked drawer. The pages smelled of oil and regret. Dad wrote this before the accident. He always said, "Never trust the paperwork when the numbers don't add up." Outside, the wind rattled the window. Ava leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "Delete every trace. If Rick finds out, he'll bury this, like he buried my father's warnings." They exchanged a look, equal parts dread and defiance. For a moment, Mason felt less alone. Mason was trembling when he thanked her. "I'm scared, Ava. What if I mess this up?" She gave him a long, steady look. "My dad always said courage is doing it anyway." That night, Jake tossed and turned in a bed that felt too big for one person. He dreamed in fragments, gunfire and sand, smoke in his lungs, a radio crackling. "We lost him, Carter. He didn't make it." He woke to the echo of a promise unkept. He found Mason staring at a computer screen, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. The boy's voice barely rose above a whisper. "You always say to do what's right, no matter the cost. But what if I mess up?" Jake knelt by his son, voice rough. "Doing the right thing never makes you weak, son. It makes you brave." Mason let the words settle in his heart. He turned back to the screen. The evidence was there, enough maybe to bring the truth out. But it was also a target. Every click felt like a step closer to danger. As the wind battered the window, the world felt very small. A father and son, battered but unbroken, facing a storm of their own making. Mason's next move was a leap. Reckless. Necessary. At dawn, while Jake was at work, Mason printed the most damning pages from Ava's files and his own research. He stuffed them in his jacket, heart thumping so hard he could hardly breathe. Each step to Pine Creek felt like trespassing into enemy territory. He wasn't a soldier, not like his father. He was just a kid, but the truth burned inside him. At the lot, Mason waited until the lunch shift before slipping inside the break room. He slid the documents into Ava's battered metal locker. She'd know what to do. His hands shook as he dialed her number from the payphone outside, but he hung up before she answered. There was no way to explain what he was risking, only that it felt right. But Rick noticed Mason near the gates. The man's suspicion was a physical thing, his glare lingering long after Mason scurried off. That night, Jake noticed how quiet Mason had become. "You all right?" he asked, but Mason only shrugged, eyes haunted. Meanwhile, Ava connected the dots. She reached out to a journalist she trusted, Sandra Lee, a former Navy intel officer turned investigative reporter, known for exposing rot in high places. "If something happens to me," Ava wrote, attaching the files, "make this public. Don't let them bury it again." At home, Jake struggled with flashbacks. He would stare at his scarred hands, remembering the last time he'd trusted an order that turned out to be wrong. In the darkness, the boundaries between Dovetail and Iraq blurred. "Not again," he whispered, fists clenched. He needed to protect Mason, even from the truth. Then the phone rang. Tex's rough voice cut through the static. "I made the delivery. The kids in Maple Hollow, they got the medicine. You did good, Carter. You did damn good." For the first time in days, Jake let himself exhale. Mason watched him from the hallway, uncertain whether to step forward or let his father have that small, private victory. But the world doesn't wait for healing. The next morning, rumors swept through the scrapyard. Pine Creek was under investigation. Auditors, men in suits, men with badges swept the lot. Rick blustered and barked, but there was a tremor in his hands. Mason watched from the sidewalk, hoping he hadn't made things worse. When Ava sent him a single word, "safe," his shoulders dropped. Sandra Lee's story was scheduled to air the following night. At home, the tension was thick. Jake didn't yet know how deeply his son had gotten involved, but he felt it in the way Mason hovered, restless, like a bird before a storm. That night, as they sat at the small kitchen table eating canned soup, Mason finally spoke. "I did something," he said, voice shaking. "I found stuff, logs, evidence. I gave it to Ava. She's giving it to a reporter." Jake's spoon paused mid-air. The room seemed to freeze. "I just wanted to help. I didn't want you to be alone," Mason whispered, tears threatening. Jake stood, moved around the table, and wrapped his son in an embrace so fierce it left them both breathless. "You're never alone," he said into Mason's hair. "We fight together. Always." Mason clung to his father, the fear and relief tangled together. Jake knew there would be fallout. There always was. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Outside, the storm that had battered Dovetail for days finally broke, leaving the night impossibly still. But in the stillness, both father and son understood. The hardest part was still to come. The morning Sandra Lee's story broke, Dovetail was waking to a different kind of storm. It was early, just past dawn, when the headlines splashed across news feeds and radios. "Whistleblower exposes corruption, endangers military supply lines." Rick Jordan's name was everywhere. So was Pine Creek Logistics. The article didn't mention Jake or Mason, but inside their apartment, both could feel the ripple, like the air right before thunder. Jake poured coffee with shaking hands. Outside, the street was oddly quiet. Neighbors peering from windows, police cruisers and black SUVs blocking the warehouse entrance. Workers gathered in tense clumps, phones glowing with anxious texts. In the living room, Mason paced, twisting the cord of his hoodie, the uncertainty almost worse than guilt. The doorbell rang. Not a knock, an electric, sharp trill. Jake's heart dropped, a lifetime of bad news condensed into that sound. When he opened the door, he saw a tall man in a simple button-down and jeans, a ball cap pulled low, and something in his posture that was both relaxed and alert. "Jake Carter?" "That's me." The man smiled, extending a business card. "Dalton National Freight, Midwest Regional." "My name's Ken," he said. "We're looking for good mechanics. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Jake glanced at Mason, who hovered in the kitchen archway, eyes wide. There was something about Ken. Too clean for the scrapyard, too at ease for a stranger. "Can't hurt," Jake answered, voice careful. They sat at the table, Ken appraising the room, noting the careful order in their threadbare life. "Word travels fast in this business," Ken said. "I heard about a certain all-night repair job. A sick kids clinic, wasn't it?" Jake shrugged, suddenly wary. "I did what anyone would have done." Ken's smile deepened. "Not everyone would, Mr. Carter. That's exactly why I'm here. Got a rig parked outside, top of the line. I'd like you to take a look." Mason's eyes lit up despite himself. Jake hesitated, but something, maybe hope, maybe pride, pushed him forward. Together, the three walked out to the street, where a truck sat gleaming in the new sunlight. Jake slid under the chassis, listened, tested, felt the machine's heart. He noticed a vibration, a telltale tremor in the drive shaft. It was a subtle flaw, one only a real mechanic, one who listened with more than just his ears would ever spot. Jake glanced at the offer letter, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "Why me? Why now? Last time I trusted someone, it cost us everything." Ken didn't answer right away. He placed a photo of Tex, smiling in a hospital bed, on the table. "Because you didn't ask for anything. You just acted. Men like you keep the world running." Jake's hands shook, torn between pride and fear. What if I can't do it? What if I fail again? Mason stepped forward, voice firmer than ever. "Dad, you always told me helping is what makes you brave. Maybe it's our turn to let someone help us." Jake met his son's eyes and nodded, the weight of the decision settling like relief. At that moment, the warehouse gates opened. A pair of officers led Rick Jordan away in cuffs. Reporters pressed in, flashbulbs erupting. Some workers wept, others cheered. Ken didn't look away. "Your son's a good kid, Jake. You did right by him. You both did right." Mason, silent until now, stepped forward, voice trembling but sure. "We just wanted to help. That's all." Ken smiled. "That's all it ever takes." As the sun climbed higher, the three stood in the street, the future suddenly, if only for a moment, wide open. Here is the falling action section, picking up directly from the moment of hope and justice, with a steady, heartfelt tone. 5. Falling action. The news traveled faster than the trucks that once rumbled down Pine Creek's battered roads. By noon, Rick Jordan's arrest was front page everywhere in Dovetail. Workers at the depot gathered outside, some shaking hands, others still unable to process that the man who'd ruled with threats and shortcuts was finally gone. Inside their apartment, the mood had shifted. Jake stood by the window, sunlight breaking through clouds, a mug of coffee warming his hands for the first time in weeks. Mason sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a packet marked Dalton National Freight Welcome Kit. His name, typed clean and hopeful, sat just below Jake's. Mason's phone vibrated, a message from Ava. "Ava, they offered me Dad's old job, safety supervisor. I think he'd be proud. Tell your dad thank you." Jake smiled as Mason read it aloud, pride and relief mingling in the stillness. "She's going to make this place better," Mason said, voice quiet, as if afraid that hope was something that could break if spoken too loudly. Jake crossed the room, ruffling his son's hair. "So will we, kiddo. So will we." 2 days later, Jake and Mason stood in the main office at Dalton National, signing paperwork in the hush of fresh beginnings. Ken Dalton shook their hands, introducing Jake as the man who fixes more than just trucks. Tex, freshly shaved, stood at Jake's side, clutching a clipboard and already outlining ideas for a veterans outreach program. Jobs, counseling, a community for anyone lost in the transition from uniform to civilian life. In a quiet moment, Mason looked at Jake, worry surfacing beneath the joy. "Are you sure we deserve this? After everything?" Jake knelt, eye level with his son. "Deserve's got nothing to do with it. We're here because we stood up, even when it cost us. That's how you build something that lasts." One chilly morning, a new recruit fumbled with an engine bolt. Grease streaked across his cheeks. Jake knelt beside him, showing the right grip, offering a quiet, "You'll get there." We all start shaky. Mason, nearby, shared sandwiches with the recruit's little sister, telling her about the time my dad saved a whole truck full of medicine. As sunlight spilled through the workshop doors, the echoes of laughter, lessons, and second chances rippled out. Proof that courage, once shared, only grows. The old world, the world of silence, fear, and keeping your head down, was gone. In its place, second chances, earned and given, braided together by ordinary courage. In a small but unmistakable way, things had changed, for the better. The world didn't suddenly become perfect. The rent still needed paying, the trucks still broke down, and the future, well, the future was never certain. But as the weeks slipped by, Jake and Mason found themselves breathing easier, shoulders lighter. At Dalton National, Jake was more than a mechanic. He was a leader, a mentor, a quiet force for change. Workers who once kept their heads down now brought him their worries, their ideas, their stories. Mason, too, was changing. His health was still fragile, but the treatments, the best they could finally afford, offered a kind of hope that felt real for the first time in years. At school, he started to speak up in class, help other kids fix their laptops, and even tell a few friends the truth about what happened at Pine Creek. The fear of being a burden faded, replaced by something steadier: belonging. One chilly evening, Dalton National hosted its first Veterans and Families Night. The warehouse was lit by strings of yellow lights, long tables groaning with food, laughter echoing across the parking lot. Jake was asked to give a few words. He hesitated, then stood before the crowd. Tex beside him, Mason beaming in the front row, Ava standing tall with a clipboard. Jake spoke, voice steady, words simple but true. Doing the right thing is rarely easy. Sometimes it costs you more than you thought you could give. But it's what makes us who we are. Courage isn't loud. Most of the time it's quiet, choosing to stand up when no one else does. Mason, cheeks flushed, shared a few lines of his own. I used to think helping meant being strong, or perfect, or never scared. But I think maybe it just means not turning away, even when it's hard. My dad taught me that. So did everyone in this room. Tex closed the evening, his voice gravelly but warm. If you're out there and you feel lost, remember, there's always someone who will stand with you. Sometimes, they're the last people you'd expect. As the crowd dispersed, Ken Dalton shook Jake's hand, whispering, "You gave us more than a fix. You gave us something to believe in. Now, the story is yours. Would you risk your future to save someone you barely know? What would you do in Jake's place? If this story touched you, like, share, and subscribe. And let us know in the comments. What's the bravest thing you've ever done for someone else? Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage sets a new course for everyone it touches. And that's what really happened.